War is a great accelerator of inventions and their exploitation. If peace had generally prevailed in the first half of the 20th century, as it had done for most of the 19th, the innovations of the Wright brothers and Blériot would no doubt have been slow to mature. Furthermore, the ways in which they did develop might have proved irrelevant to the needs of warfare. War in itself, much more than in the possible prospects of it, generates the most important advances in machinery and weapons. None more so than airships and aeroplanes, which were seized by the compelling appetite of war when they were scarcely beyond their early age of infancy. Before the First World War, flying had caught the imagination of the public, and within a short space of just a few years, all of the major nations were developing aircraft. Louis Blériot had taken the first major step forward in powered flight when in June 1909 he became the first person to fly across the English Channel. This confirmed the belief amongst some countries that aircraft could eventually have a military role. Germany was one of those countries. As early as 1884, she had developed the use of lighter-than-air balloons as observation platforms, and by 1910, out of the 26 large airships in the world, 14 of them were German. But the military was still not convinced of the aircraft's ability as a weapon of war. Although the armies involved had planned at the outset that this was going to be a war fought by a campaign of movement, it was quite the reverse. The First World War was to become a war of the trenches. The armies found themselves caught in a static struggle between increasingly sophisticated and ever denser defense systems. Two giant armies of equal strength were trapped, facing each other in a network of trenches with no way forward and no way back. But as the war progressed, so too did the development of new weapons and machinery. The sheer power of new mass-produced weaponry then available gave the armies no alternative but to go to ground, for this was above all a war of artillery, the German army being much better equipped at the time with heavy guns. The tank was also going to prove its worth. The mortar was used for the first time. And hand grenades, which had become obsolete 200 years previously, were again brought into use. Perhaps one of the most important advances in mechanized weaponry was the machine gun. The very nature of warfare itself was rapidly undergoing a metamorphosis, with new techniques in artillery and infantry tactics. With the position of each side and the location of reinforcements becoming more and more important, it became increasingly necessary to find an alternative and more accurate and comprehensive means of reconnaissance. This was traditionally carried out by the cavalry, but far-sighted powers felt that here was an ideal use for the aeroplane. It became obvious that the chief thing an aircraft could do in war was survey the enemy. Two-seater scout aircraft were sent out by both sides to monitor enemy movements and positions. Special cameras were developed for use by the observer. On occasions, these scout aircraft also dropped primitive bombs on the ground troops below. But as intelligence of enemy movements became more valuable, it also paid an opponent to try and prevent its gathering. And aircraft soon began to arm themselves, first with rifles and revolvers, and then with mounted machine guns. The types that had been specifically designed and used for reconnaissance by Germany were all similar in specification. Companies such as Albatros, Rumpler, Pfalz and Aviatik all produced aircraft for the role. Originally, the pilot had sat in the rear seat with the observer seated up front, but this was later reversed when it was found that the gun position mounted in the rear had a much better arc of defensive fire away from the hindrance of the wing struts and braces. Most of them were powered with Mercedes engines and could fly at speeds of nearly 150 kilometers an hour with a flying ceiling of around 5,000 meters. Designers soon began to think of aircraft not just as platforms of observation, but as fighting machines. These new fighting scouts, as they were called, first appeared in 1915 and began to do battle with each other. The British adapted their original reconnaissance machines, such as the FE-2B, with its added armament on a free-rotating ring fired by the observer. But in Germany, things were different. The Dutch designer Fokker came up with a new machine specifically designed for the job. The Fokker monoplane. This was fitted with an interrupter gear to make it possible to fire directly through the propeller, thus enabling the pilot to aim the aircraft at its target. A fundamental principle of air power emerged, the ulterior motive, observation of the enemy. The appearance of the Fokker monoplane in May 1915 placed a new meaning on this concept. It was the very first fighter or pursuit aircraft in history. Very soon the British pilots were talking of the Fokker Scourge. Germany also took the lead in aerial warfare in another development of the aircraft, for they were the first to determine that if an aircraft could fly over enemy lines to observe them, could they not also drop explosives on them, and furthermore, could they not also fly behind enemy lines and bomb targets behind them? Aircraft had not yet been designed with a long enough range, but Germany did have the Zeppelins. They could cruise for hours and carry much heavier loads than any scout or fighter aircraft. Germany opened a campaign of aerial bombing against England. The first target was Yarmouth on the night of January the 19th, 1915. Thereafter, attacks were increased until on the night of the 31st of May, 14 airships attacked and bombed London. This caused much outcry and outrage out of all proportion to the damage actually inflicted on the city. The British, used to comparative immunity from the effects of war, had not expected any such intrusion. There were 51 such attacks during the war, dropping over 200 tons of bombs on the city. During the course of 1916, it became apparent that something much faster and more maneuverable than an airship was needed if that sort of attack was to be maintained and increased. Germany's determination to find a solution produced a chain reaction, which in fact governed the nature of air power until the arrival of guided missiles and nuclear weapons almost half a century later. Early in 1917, Germany introduced a new breed of aircraft into service. This was the twin-engined Gotha bomber. The Gotha was the very first authentic long-range heavy bomber in the history of aviation. On June the 13th, 1917, a formation of 14 Gotha bombers appeared over the centre of London in broad daylight and dropped 118 bombs in the city centre. Nearly 100 British fighters went up to engage the German bombers, but failed. All 14 aircraft returned safely to their base in Belgium. There were immediate repercussions. 2 British fighter squadrons were brought back from France to reinforce the defences of London. Meanwhile, the bombers returned once again, inflicting further damage on the capital. In 1914, when World War I had begun, the aeroplane was still a crude, powered box kite of dubious strength and reliability. But with the advent of the Fokker monoplane and the various aircraft that were rapidly brought off the drawing boards into the air soon afterwards, the new breed of aeroplane, and in particular the Fighting Scout, were rapidly becoming much more sophisticated. By the end of 1915, the new fighters, in a rapid attempt by the opposing forces' determination to deny each other the advantages of aerial observation, were relatively reliable aerobatic weapons. One of these new Fighting Scouts to come off the drawing boards was the Albatros. Manufactured in 1915 by the Albatros Flugzeugwerk over 80 years ago, this aircraft, which has now been restored to its original specification, belongs to Cole Palin's old Rhinebeck Aerodrome in the state of New York. This is an Albatros D-Series variant, which was their single-seater fighter scout. It was powered by a Mercedes 6-cylinder inline water-cooled engine, which developed 160 horsepower. Later variants had 150 horsepower and 180 horsepower engines. One of the problems with flying aircraft from this period, according to the pilots who fly them today, is that landing them can be difficult. The aircraft weren't fitted with brakes, and once on the ground, the pilot had to cut the engine whilst the ground crews would run alongside and catch the aircraft. There was also no steering mechanism, so once you'd landed, you were quite simply out of control of your aircraft. It would be up to the ground crews to slow you down and get you pointed in the right direction before bringing the aircraft to a standstill. The Albatross was fitted with twin Spandau machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller. If attacked from behind, the pilot had absolutely no defense other than to take evasive action to avoid being shot down. The streamlined fuselage gave the aircraft a pleasing appearance with almost graceful lines and curves. The great German air ace Oswald Boelcke flew an Albatross, as did the legendary Baron Manfred von Richthofen. In fact, Richthofen scored many of his 80 victories in an aircraft just like this one. The fuselage of this aircraft is made of wood, unlike its counterparts, which were covered in canvas. The standard colour scheme was a natural wood finish with painted wings and markings depending on which squadron the aircraft belonged to. Von Richthofen, however, broke tradition. His aircraft was painted in bright red. When he started his flying career as an observer, he had originally flown in the earlier variant of the Albatross, which was the C-type. Albatross, although overshadowed by the rival Fokker factory and their potent fighters, probably produced in terms of engineering and quality the best all-round fighters and reconnaissance aircraft of the war. Both the C-types and the later D-types were startlingly efficient aircraft and played an enormous part in achieving and retaining air superiority in the skies over the battlefields of France. The first Albatross C-type left the factory in 1915. This was a two-seater version with pilot and navigator. The C designating the type given by the military for an armed reconnaissance aircraft. The C-1 had entered service in the spring of 1915 and served in substantial numbers. Its performance was such that it was able to carry out light bombing tasks and aerial photography in addition to its intended role. It was a compact and sturdy aircraft which carried out its role well into 1917 and even then continued in secondary roles. The D-type Albatross, which was the single-seater fighter version of this aircraft, was first delivered to the squadrons in December 1916. The D-1 was soon followed by the D-2, and later the D-3, D-4 and D-5. The D-3 was perhaps the most effective version of the Albatross fighter scouts, with a modified wing and an upgraded engine. Oswald Boelcke had developed his famous principles of air fighting while flying in an Albatross, and the aircraft became the major equipment of the 37 Jastas, which had by then been formed. Their original role was to offer protection to the two-seater scout planes on reconnaissance missions. As the war progressed, however, this use changed to a primary defense role. They would be sent out to lay in wait for the Allied two-seaters to cross the line, whereupon they would attack, usually coming from out of the sun with devastating success. The Albatross works were known for their quality of production, and although other factories also produced the Albatross under license, the main factory's aircraft proved far more reliable. Albatross also produced aircraft under license from other manufacturers, including their main rival, Fokker. And it's interesting that even when producing another manufacturer's aircraft, their quality was superb. It was well known that the Fokkers produced under license by the Albatross factory proved far more sturdy and reliable than those that came out of Fokker's own factory. This was partly due to the fact that Albatross had access to much better and more powerful engines than Fokker and were quick to secure most of the new engines that Mercedes could produce. The Albatross works were also much larger and better equipped than Fokker's smaller and almost ramshackle works. The Fokker Scourge, as it was known, was brought to an end by the British and French in time for the opening of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. New aircraft, such as these French Nieuport babies, helped bring about that turn in air superiority, as did the introduction of the British pusher aircraft, the FE-2B. This aircraft had a top speed of 140 kilometers an hour and was surprisingly maneuverable for a pusher type. By the winter of 1916, however, with Germany now using the new Albatros and similar types, the tide of air power was turning yet again in favour of Germany, and French and British aircraft losses mounted heavily. The new German aircraft had far better performance and were much more capable in battle than their enemy. It was at this time in the war, at the suggestion of one of Germany's top fighter aces, Oswald Bolker, that the fighters began to operate in the air in complete squadrons of 14 aircraft. This gave them numerical superiority over their opponents. The French began using various types of new SPAD aircraft, both single and two-seater variants. They also introduced the Nieuport 17, some of which were used by the British alongside the Sopwith Pup. This was their first effective single-seat fighting scout, which was first operated at the end of 1916. The Pup was joined by the Sopwith triplane, the two-seater Bristol fighter affectionately known as the Brisfit, and shown here the FE-5, which proved itself to be one of the best fighters of the war. It was not, however, speed which gave these aircraft the edge. Indeed, during the 4 years of war, this rose no more than about 60 kilometers an hour from the 130 or 140 kilometers an hour achievable during 1914. Rather, it was maneuverability, especially during the turn and the rate of climb. All of these aircraft and others were put up against the Albatros and other C-type scouts and earlier Fokker monoplanes. But there was another new aircraft coming out of the German factories, one which was to become possibly the most famous of World War I, due not to its performance, but the fact that it was the aircraft made famous by Baron Manfred von Richthofen and his flying circus, the Aster 11. Once again, it was the turn of Fokker to produce an aircraft that would regain air superiority for Germany. The new aircraft was the Fokker DR-1 triplane. The legend which has grown around the Fokker triplane owes a great deal to its use by Manfred von Richthofen, and in fact his death whilst flying number 425/17 on the 21st of April 1918. Von Richthofen was quoted as praising the aircraft. It climbed like a monkey and maneuvered like the devil. Most pilots in Richthofen's Jagdgeschwader flew the aircraft until April 1918. During the first big air battle over Le Cateau on March the 18th, 1918, 60 German single-seater fighters took part. The majority of them were Fokker DR-1 triplanes, one of which was 152/17, the aircraft flown by Manfred von Richthofen. Contrary to all the sensational claims by the Allies, von Richthofen's triplanes were perfectly standard aircraft and carried no more than the 2 regulation machine guns. Every weekend, one aircraft in particular draws the crowds to the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome in New York. Their original Fokker DR-1 triplane, which has been restored to its original condition and still flies today in the colours of Manfred von Richthofen. Designed by Reinhold Platz, who was not entirely convinced of the merits of a triplane layout. With the shortage of powerful engine plants at the time, bearing in mind that the Mercedes 160 horsepower water-cooled engines had all been taken by the Albatros factory, Fokker decided to concentrate on rate of climb and maneuverability rather than speed. The Fokker triplane was the result. The Fokker machine was originally designated the Fokker F1 in 1917, but this was changed to Fokker DR, signifying Dreidecker or triplane. The length of the aircraft was only 5.7 meters, with a wingspan of 7.2 meters. From the ground to the top of the wing was 2.9 meters. The total area of wing surface which gave it its maneuverability and climbing ability was 18.7 square meters. When the aircraft was unladen, it weighed 405 kilograms. When fully fueled and loaded, it weighed 585 kilograms. It was fitted with two standard regulation Spandau machine guns, which were synchronized to fire through the propeller, and each of these guns could be fired independently. With its triple bank of wings, its clean lines and almost total absence of wires and struts, it seemed to almost float in the air. To get airborne, the aircraft only needed 45 meters of airstrip. It took to the air with very little effort required from its pilot. In the hands of a master pilot, it was a supreme aircraft. When the new Fokker appeared on the Western Front, most of the German fighter pilots took to it instantly and were full of praise for its flying qualities. It was everything they wanted a fighter scout to be. It had a much superior rate of climb and it maneuvered superbly. Its instant response to its highly sensitive controls demanded no effort from the pilot whatsoever. A pilot could even make a completely flat turn in it, reversing direction in just 4 seconds without even banking the wings. So maneuverable was this aircraft in combat that many Allied pilots never got the opportunity to find out just how slow it was and how short a range the aircraft had. Fokker's triplane was the first fighting aeroplane to use a thick aerofoil section, which gave the machine gentle stall and excellent behavior at low speeds. In combat, the aircraft was extremely strong and could absorb a great amount of battle damage from enemy fire. This was notably through the fact that there were no bracing wires that could be shot away. It could hit speeds of 160 kilometers an hour plus at low level and could climb at a spectacular rate of 1,000 meters in just 2 minutes and only 10 minutes to 4,000 meters to a maximum ceiling of over 6,000 meters. In von Richthofen's autobiography, he recalled, "Flying the triplane for the first time in combat, I and 4 gentlemen of Staffel 11 attacked a very courageously flown British artillery spotting aircraft. I approached until it was 50 meters below me and fired 20 shots, whereupon the adversary went down out of control and crashed on this side of the lines near Sonneberg. Apparently the adversary had mistaken me for a British Sopwith triplane, as the observer had stood up in his machine without making a move to attack me with his machine gun." This victory was logged as Richthofen's 60th, and it was the very first one he'd accomplished in a Fokker triplane. 2 days later, Richthofen scored another victory, again in his triplane, when JG-1's morning patrol jumped a flight of British Sopwith pups of No. 46 Squadron over Mini. Although Richthofen was flying the triplane, the rest of the squadron were flying Albatros DVs. The British had crossed over the line and were about 5 kilometers from Richthofen's own airfield when they were attacked. The effect of the air battle that followed was later described by Englishman Lieutenant Arthur Gould Lee, who later became an Air Vice Marshal of the Royal Air Force. The news is not good. The squadron has taken a hammering. The first patrol quickly ran into trouble. 5 of the A flight met Richthofen Circus and had a hectic battle. The pups were completely outclassed by the Albatros DVs, and most of their share of the fighting was spent trying to avoid being hit rather than shooting at the enemy. 2 of our pilots were seen to go down over enemy lines. I think a third might have gone down over our side. The 2 pilots that managed to get away but were badly shot up stated that one of the enemy was flying a bright red triplane. It must have been one of our Sopwiths which had been captured. In fact, one of Richthofen's fellow pilots had shot down the first Sopwith pup, and Richthofen had followed by shooting the second, which he then forced to land in German-held territory. Richthofen's determination was tempered by respect for his British adversary, as was often the case with Richthofen and his squadron. Richthofen recalled, "I was absolutely convinced that in front of me I had a very skillful pilot, who even at 50 meters altitude did not give up the fight, but continued to fire, and even when flattening out before landing, fired again at one of our infantry columns before deliberately steering his machine into a tree. I'm convinced now that the Fokker triplane is absolutely superior to the British Sopwith." The Fokker triplane was the vehicle of von Richthofen's immortality, and also his death, but it was in fact only ever used by a few units, used in relatively small numbers, with a total of 320 ever being produced and only 171 operating in frontline service at any one time. Whilst there's no doubt that this was a fine fighting machine in the hands of an expert such as von Richthofen, to the less gifted pilots it was an unforgiving machine and suffered structural weaknesses which curtailed its operational career. Although the landing speeds were low, it was very difficult for the pilot to see the ground below, his vision being hindered by the lower wing. Many pilots experienced more than uncomfortable landings. The long-awaited triplanes did not prove to be the wonder weapons that German fighter pilots hoped they would be. A series of incidents, including one with Manfred von Richthofen's brother, Lothar, when his aircraft appeared to come apart in the air, raised questions about the new fighters. In November 1917, all of the Fokker triplanes were grounded, pending a complete investigation into structural problems that had resulted in tragic accidents. There were also further operational problems, as Richthofen, amongst others, felt that owing to the poor quality of oil that was available, the rotary engine was no longer suitable. Despite its shortfalls, opinions amongst those that flew them were varied. Hauptmann von Tutschek claimed that the Fokker DR-1 was superior in dogfighting to any contemporary Allied fighter, better even than the 200 horsepower Spad single-seater. He claimed to have put his own machine into a near vertical dive until it reached its terminal velocity in excess of 240 kilometers an hour. This was just possible, but not very probable. Ernst Udet stated in early 1918 that to him the Fokker triplane seemed to be the ideal fighter aeroplane. He regarded it as superior to the Sopwith Camel in maneuverability and in rate of climb. Less enthusiastic were those pilots who were built on more generous lines than the average model. The cockpit was not built for any long-legged pilots, and another criticism was the poor view when taking off or touching down, because the fuselage was short and the undercarriage tall. During the latter part of 1917 and early 1918, these and many other pilots like them enjoyed a period of air superiority over the enemy. The distinctive colours of von Richthofen's legendary blood-red flying machine have gone down in the annals of aviation history, and although he actually scored 59 of his victories flying a red Albatross, the Fokker triplane has become known as Richthofen's trademark. This replica of Richthofen's machine is flown by a Canadian company at air shows and displays all over the United States of America. One of the pilots who flies this aircraft, a veteran with some 60 years of flying experience, recalls, "Of all the machines that I've ever flown, the triplane remains in my memory as being the best for the actual pleasure of flying an aircraft that I have ever taken up. It was so beautifully balanced, so well-mannered, so feather-light on the stick, and so comfortable and warm for its docility. It needed the minimum amount of effort to fly it, and yet its instantaneous response to the lightest touch, it remains my favourite. I have flown other machines from World War I which were faster, much stronger, more reliable, and had much better rates of climb and better all-round vision, but none was so friendly as the triplane. If you think about it, the triplane layout has such obvious advantages. It puzzles me why other designers did not make more use of it. The arrangement, once airborne, gives the pilot superb visibility. All three wings are very narrow, whilst the top and bottom wings are far above and below your line of sight, and the centre wing is so inline that it obscures very little of the sky. The short wingspan means you can achieve a quick rate of roll, and the narrow wings mean only the smallest travel of the centre of pressure with changing speed, so the triplane can have a short fuselage, which enables the pilot to do marvellous things with manoeuvrability, especially in turning. About the only disadvantage is the interference drag of the triple wing. One should not make the mistake of looking at the designs of World War I aeroplanes as being backward or old-fashioned. It is doubtful, bearing in mind the engines that were then available, that a modern aircraft designer could do any better. Whilst a piston or jet engine is of course much more reliable than those old rotary engines, the power-to-weight ratios are not notably better. And I'd much rather fly in one of the old triplanes than one of today's modern jet fighters. It just gave you the sheer enjoyment of flying without having to worry about how. The German Fokker and Albatros fighting scouts were enjoying air superiority once again, the British had another aircraft coming out of the factories, which they hoped would turn the tide in their favour, the Sopwith Camel. This was a biplane fighter with a powerful 180 horsepower engine and an airframe of immense strength compared to its adversaries. In the hands of an expert, although difficult to fly, the Sopwith Camel was one of the best British fighters of the war, and soon earned respect from the German pilots for its potent ability. It was a Sopwith Camel that von Richthofen was chasing in April 1918 when he was shot down over enemy lines. It was also a Sopwith Camel that claimed the victory for shooting him down, although there is still doubt as to whether he was hit by another fighter or ground fire from the infantry on the ground. Camels were also used as fighter bombers attacking ground troops in the trenches. Not only did they give tactical support, but also gained valuable intelligence on enemy positions. It seemed that once again the role of air superiority was changing. The British Camels and the French Spads were winning many aerial victories over the German triplanes and Albatros scouts. They were also beginning to venture further into enemy territory in ever-increasing daring raids. Germany, however, had yet another ace card up her sleeve, and once again this was to come out of the Fokker aircraft factory. It was in fact Manfred von Richthofen who put this brand new Fokker to the test at flight trials in January 1918. This aircraft from Fokker had one advantage over his previous aircraft, for his new prototype had the powerful Mercedes engine. Von Richthofen had flown the new Fokker once before, with not very impressive results. However, with some slight modifications, he was asked to test it once again. The result was that von Richthofen found it a delight to fly, and completely free of any problems or necessary adjustments or modifications. Fokker was immediately asked to build 400 of the new planes, and furthermore the factories of Albatros and AEG were also ordered to build even more on license from Fokker. This aircraft made Fokker a millionaire overnight. The new aircraft was the devastating Fokker D7, unquestionably one of the best fighting aircraft of all time. It is said that war spurs the rapid advancement of many things. This was certainly true in the case of this new aircraft to come off the Fokker production lines. The first combat version of the Fokker D7 was delivered to the famous squadron of von Richthofen only 2 months after the first prototype trials. Although von Richthofen had flown the aircraft on tests and had approved it, he continued to use his legendary Fokker triplane, in which he later died. News spread very fast amongst the Allied pilots that there was a new aeroplane which would rekindle the dreaded Fokker scourge. This Fokker D7 is another of the restored aircraft flown at Old Rheinbeck in New York. This single-seat biplane was generally regarded as being Germany's finest fighting scout of the First World War. One pilot who flew this aircraft, which is one of the few remaining in the world today, wrote, "The aircraft flew like a puff of warm air. It would break ground on takeoff almost of its own accord, without nosing up or making any real effort. It would just float away." It was probably the easiest of all the First World War fighters to fly, and with its exceptional characteristic of its rapid rate of turn, it would outturn any of the Allied types. It will hang at about 45 degrees at low speeds and still be in full flight and very controllable. The engine was reliable, although the Mercedes was a little underpowered at high altitude. It would start itself without a starter. You didn't have to crank it. Even more unbelievably, the aircraft is still flying today, some 80 years after it was built, and is still running on the original spark plugs. Here was a seemingly magical aeroplane with strange, thick wings and almost no struts. It seemed to be able to stand still in mid-air whilst spitting a deadly stream of lead from its twin Spandau machine guns into the soft, unprotected underbelly of its victims as they desperately struggled to climb out of its range. After the initial deliveries to Jagdgeschwader 1 in April 1918, Jagdstaffeln 26, 2, 27, 36 and 3 were fully equipped with the D7 during the month of May. The pilots were delighted with their new mounts and their victory scores mounted. On May the 1st, 19 of them were in active service. 2 months later, the total reached 407, and 2 months after that, there were 828 of these machines plaguing the Allied pilots. After the first 3 months of operational use, the standard version with a high-compression Mercedes engine ceased to be adequate to deal with the opposing Allied types, such as the British Sopwith Camel, American Curtiss, and the French Nieuport. In particular, their shortfall was in its performance at high altitude. Above 4,500 meters, the maneuverability deteriorated. This was soon overcome by fitting a BMW 185 horsepower engine, which had a much better high-altitude performance and was considerably faster. The new version was, of course, much sought after, but only limited production of the engines was available, so the majority of the airframes had the Mercedes power plant. There were other criticisms of the aircraft amongst pilots. These related mainly to the bad manufacturing by the Fokker factory. The fuel tanks would open at the seams, and even more serious operational trouble was caused by the overheating of the ammunition boxes in flight. This resulted in several of the aircraft bursting into flames in the sky. Enemy action could be excluded as a cause. Some pilots have been able to land their burning aircraft and to prove beyond doubt that the fire originated from the phosphorus ammunition. A new kind of incendiary armor-piercing ammunition had been introduced, but this was not the cause of the trouble. On July the 17th, incendiary ammunition was forbidden for use on the D7 aircraft. When the Fokker D7 appeared on the Western Front, it created a sensation amongst Allied pilots. Lacking the more graceful lines of the Albatros and Pfalz Scouts, looked at first sight to be clumsy and inferior. But it was not long before two-seater crews brought back startling accounts of the new German fighter that appeared to be able to stand still in the air with its nose up and pour a stream of bullets into the two-seater from a blind spot. Although von Richthofen was regarded as being a champion of the Fokker triplane, he did have a very high regard for the new Fokker D7. In 1918, he wrote in a letter to the High Command at Berlin, "After a long time I come up once again with a question. When can I count on receiving the new Fokker biplanes? The superiority of the British single-seater makes it increasingly more unpleasant here at the front. The need has become very urgent now. One could shoot down 5 times as many enemy planes if we were so equipped. So please, give me news about when we can count on receiving the new machines." Fokker D7s were delivered to Richthofen in April of 1918. The Allied pilots that managed to escape from their encounters with the new Fokker were inclined to possibly overrate its ability in speed and climb. The Fokker could not, of course, stand still in the air. German pilots had quickly learned how to exploit the qualities of the thick wing section, which stalled gradually and at a rather high angle of attack. Thus, for the first time, they could approach a two-seater from below where the observer could not bring his guns to bear and make their attacks with the Fokker in an almost stalled condition with full throttle and nose high. This maneuver was safe and simple, for the aircraft was not prone to fall in a spin. In fact, the Fokker D7 needed skill and forceful handling to compel it to fall into a spin. When it did so, the motion was steep, with its nose well down, and even easier for the pilots, the aircraft tended to come out of a spin of its own accord. Clear evidence of the high regard that the Allies had for this aircraft was in the fact that in the armistice surrender terms, the Fokker D7 was the only specifically named German aeroplane that was demanded by the Allies to be immediately surrendered. When America entered the war, their air force in terms of power ranked a mere 14th in the world. In this short piece of film, we see how American airmen were trained from novices to pilots within a few weeks. They were far from ready, with only a handful of trained aviators and a great many new conscripts. They were given wooden guns to train with until the real thing could be produced in enough numbers. Within a few weeks, however, things were different. For training equipment, they molded their own bombs out of plastic. The American war effort got underway, and the factories began turning out the weapons, including these Lewis machine guns. The new aviators, having passed the required preliminary tests, were issued with leather flying kit and helmets. They were then given their assignments and the chance to be able to fly for the first time. They were given 50 hours of flying time in the air before being given their wings. These 50 hours included bombing and fighting practice. In 1916, there had been a few trained American pilots flying with France. They were the famous Latier escadrilles, started by Norman Prince, William Thor, Victor Champion, and Bert Hall, who courageously fought when Germany had full control of the skies over Europe. Factories all over America started to produce aircraft in large numbers. The Americans considered that if this war was to be over quickly, it would be done by sheer mass of manpower and equipment. The aircraft fuselage which they chose was a British design, the engine was American. The manufacture was the outstanding production achievement of the war. In all, 4,500 VH-4 aircraft powered by the Liberty engine were built in America. They were built by Ford, Lincoln, Cadillac and Packard automobile manufacturers. Curtiss, Martin and Wright, still famous plane-making names, were busy assembly plants in those days. World War I gave America a great aircraft industry. Each plane was test-flown, then thousands of parts were painstakingly dismantled for packing under guard, crated and addressed, and off to the front. In France, the aircraft parts were unpacked in order to be reassembled into the fighting craft, which would be put up against the mighty German Fokkers. May 1918, the first American DH-4s rolled directly from assembly sheds to the airfields. Only 8 months after they were ordered into production, they joined American aviators ready for the big push. When the order to prepare for battle was given, truckloads of aerial bombs were delivered to the planes, where air armourers fused the bombs and loaded the racks. Then the pilots who had to take them up made sure the job was done right. This was going to be part of what became known as the Big Push. It was a September morning in 1918 when everything was ready. The British, French and Americans had asked for every Allied airplane that could fight. The Allies wanted the largest air force possible to control the skies over the St-Mihiel sector. This was one of the main fields of battle. Every Allied field on the continent gave its planes. The orders had called for 1,500. They actually got 1,481 off the ground. The wooden props spit into the air and the engines began to rev up. This was going to be one of the biggest air battles of the war, and the plan was to outnumber German aircraft by 3-1. Some had orders to bomb and strafe German installations, others to engage the Fokkers and Albatros fighters in the air. Germany put up everything they could in a bold and courageous fight, but by this time in the war, the sheer weight of their opponent's force in terms of men and aircraft was overwhelming. The sky was a beehive of battle, both sides struggling to achieve air superiority over their opponents. By the end of the war, the feats of men like these had caught the admiration of the general public on both sides, the exploits of the great fighter aces. The Frenchman Georges Guillemot became a national hero, as did Nungesser and Fonck. Shy 20-year-old Albert Ball was one of many British aces. Once the United States entered the war, the Americans too produced their aces, like Eddie Rickenbacker and Raoul Lufbery, who began his flying career as a volunteer with the French. But Germany probably had the greatest, men such as Max Immermann, Oswald Bolker, Voss and Ernst Udet. But probably the greatest ace of the war was Baron Manfred von Richthofen. These men and the machines they flew have all now become legends in the annals of aviation history. Manfred von Richthofen was born on the 2nd of May 1892 in Kleinburg. The Richthofen ancestry was not one of soldiers and war, but one of country estates and rural life of the landed gentry. His father was practically the first member of his branch of the family to have become a soldier, but had to resign his post because of air trouble caused by saving one of his men from drowning. In Manfred's generation, however, military life became a matter of course, and with war looming, every able-bodied member of the Richthofen family was on active service. He spent his school years first in private tuition at Kleinberg and then at a school in Schweiznitz. He began his military career at the age of 11 in the cadet corps at Wahlstatt. In 1911, he joined the army in the 1st Regiment of Uhlans as a cavalryman. In fact, all of the Richthofens entered service as cavalrymen. By 1912, von Richthofen was an officer, and 2 years later, he went to war. In June 1915, he gained his first flying experience in war as an observer with the 69th Squadron of the Flying Service. On Christmas Day 1915, von Richthofen passed his final pilot's examination and began training as a fighter pilot. By September 1916, he'd scored his first victory. On the 20th of April 1918, he scored his 80th. Manfred von Richthofen had become a legend the world over. The Allied pilots, although fearing him, had a great amount of respect for this fighter ace and called him the Red Baron because of his distinctive red aircraft. This great pilot and great leader of men never made his 81st victory. Sunday, the 21st of April, 1918. Captain Roy Brown, a Canadian pilot of the newly formed Royal Air Force, DSC, and commander of No. 209 Squadron's A-Flight, was warming up the 150 horsepower rotary engine of his Sopwith Camel. The Camel was a mighty fighter, one of the greatest fighting machines of the First World War, but it was a beast to handle. This aircraft required the skills of experienced pilots, and Captain Brown was one such pilot. As Captain Brown took off for the Somme Valley, the engine drone spitting in and out, his thoughts were on keeping the aircraft aloft, constantly adjusting the controls. Little did he know that by 11:30 that morning, his name would be written down forever in the annals of aviation history, and he was personally going to be responsible for ending the seemingly immortal era of the highest-scoring fighter ace of the First World War. Manfred von Richthofen was an excellent horseman and a proficient hunter who liked nothing better than to spend the day in the saddle hunting on the family estate. He gloried in the challenge of competition and in the thrill of the hunt and the triumph of the kill. The transition from cavalry officer to airman seemed natural to Manfred von Richthofen. He saw military aviation as being the aerial cavalry of the 20th century and swiftly adapted his fighting and leadership talents. Manfred von Richthofen was the modern embodiment of the Teutonic Knights in shining steel helmets and white cloaks that bore the Black Cross, sweeping across Europe centuries before. But he wasn't just a hunter, he was also a military organization man. He was a daring and cool-headed leader in battle. He was also a seasoned manager who knew how to use his resources to the best advantage and how to motivate those under his command. As a fighter pilot, he wrote an Air Combat Operations Manual. One of the reports stated, "My favorite way of leading a staffel is like hunting on horseback across a field. Then it is of no consequence if I turn, push ahead, or pull back." He also stated that the man who is a born horseman is almost always a born aviator. The steadiness of hand and quickness of eye which is necessary to a first-class game shot is equally necessary to the fighting pilot. Captain Manfred von Richthofen was in his early 20s when he was at the height of his fame as a national hero and successful fighter pilot. This reconstruction shot after the war shows just what the conditions were like when engaging the enemy in aerial combat. As a young pilot, Manfred von Richthofen had been watching the almost daily reports of the exploits of such men as Max Immelmann and Oswald Bolker on the Western Front. They were bringing down countless British and French machines and gaining high honours and rewards. It was little wonder that many men desired to follow such illustrious paths to glory. Von Richthofen had his chance when the great Bolker, victor in 19 aerial fights during 1915 to 1916, was taken away from the war front and told to form fighting units of single-seat fighter scout aircraft. By mid-1916, the first 7 Jastas were being formed, with 8 more following by the August. Each Jasta consisted of 12 pilots, although this later rose to 18. With the opening of the Battle of the Somme, Bolker was ordered to head Jasta 11 and to recruit his own pilots. One of these was Manfred von Richthofen. His career as a fighter pilot was about to begin. It was Bolker who opened the Jasta's scoring, bringing down 7 British aircraft in the first 2 weeks of September 1916. And on the 17th of September, von Richthofen made his first victory. On the 28th of October, after scoring 40 air victories, Oswald Bolker's aircraft collided with another during an air battle. He died instantly. By now, Richthofen had scored 6 personal victories. The new lineup of Jasta 11, carrying on in Bolker's name following his death, went on to bring the score to a total of 86 between them up until the end of 1916. Von Richthofen's score had risen to 10, but it was to be his 11th which brought him his most important victory, and one which was to make him a national hero. On the 23rd of November, he shot down the British ace and hero, Major Lano Hawker. It was now that the legend of Baron Manfred von Richthofen was born. No sooner had he established himself amongst the most successful air fighters of the German air service than he was given the command of his own group of 4 squadrons, Jasta 4, 6, 10 and 11. This group became known as his Flying Circus, JG No. 1. The squadrons flew in groups of between 6 to 15 aircraft, although occasionally they were sent out on lone ventures. The leader, von Richthofen, had chosen to paint his aircraft a brilliant red colour, making it easily identifiable in battle for the rest of his squadron to spot. First with his Albatros Scout and then later with his legendary trademark, the Fokker DR-1 triplane. He wrote later that, "One fine day I came upon the idea of having my crate painted glaring red. The result was that absolutely everybody could not help but notice my red bird. In fact, my opponents also seemed to be not entirely unaware of it." But as notoriety arose for Jasta 11 under von Richthofen and his singular identifiable aircraft, concern spread for his safety amongst pilots, concerned that the British and French knew that he alone flew this red aircraft and had consequently put a price on his head for shooting down the Red Baron. It's interesting to note that during World War I, most of the German and Allied infantrymen on the ground knew very little about aircraft or their markings and found it difficult to distinguish which was friendly and which was the enemy. This resulted in many occasions where the pilots actually faced a barrage of bullets from their own side. All of Richthofen's men flew wonderfully. They had the best teachers. The squadrons were moved from place to place, depending where the battle was thickest, or wherever the British and French reconnaissance machines' activities had been the busiest. But as a rule, it concentrated on the British front. Wherever they pitched the tents, they would do the regular squadron performances in the morning, followed later in the day by lone raids or strafing flights. It's no wonder that with these brightly coloured machines and the twice-daily shows of aerial wizardry, they soon became known by the British as von Richthofen's travelling circus. Whenever possible, the British would try and locate the temporary airstrips and run strafing attacks on the aircraft on the ground, sometimes with devastating results. On the 10th of March 1917, a new pilot joined Richthofen's Jasta 11, Manfred's brother, Lothar. The propaganda machine burst into action, for now there were two Richthofens flying together to defeat the enemy in the air. Lothar later recalled, when I arrived at my brother's Staffel as a complete beginner, Manfred gave me one of his old machines in which he had attained his first 10 aerial victories. Likewise, he gave me a pair of his old leather flying gloves. As luck would have it, I shot down my first 10 Englishmen armed with these gloves and this machine. Lothar also noticed that other well-known flyers observed certain almost superstitious practices. For example, his brother Manfred achieved all of his aerial victories wearing the same old leather jacket. Kurt Wolff never flew without his lucky nightcap. As proof that these rituals should be followed, Lothar recalled that Kurt Windgens always flew with his riding crop, and the one time he left it behind in his quarters was the day he was killed. Oswald Bolker forbade his picture being taken just before starting out on a flight, and the one time this rule was violated was on the same day he died. Such was the skill of Lothar Richthofen as a fighting pilot that within 2 weeks he had shot down his first enemy. Von Richthofen was a model of daring and leadership in air war. He wrote his own Air Combat Operations Manual, which sets out in methodical detail the necessary elements to become successful in both initiating and repulsing air attacks. These are some of his basic principles. The commander flies to where the assembled Staffel leaders have taken up their prescribed places. It's advisable that each Staffel has its own emblem marking. The commander's aircraft must be very conspicuously painted. The aircraft in the formation should fly at the same altitude in a precise, organized formation. The most favorable situation is when one can get between an intruding enemy formation and the front. One cuts off its escape, gets above it, and forces it to fight. The continuous attack ensures success. Every individual counts the number of opponents the moment he sights them. When the offensive begins, everyone must ascertain where all of the enemy aeroplanes are at all times. The commander should not focus his attention on single enemy aircraft. He should fly towards the main body. Once the commander swoops into a dive to attack the enemy formation, it must be the aim of each and every pilot to be the first to engage the opposition. The one who is closest to an opponent is the one alone who should open fire on him. The simplest thing is to surprise a single-seat fighter from behind, then the main point is to make tighter turns to stay above the opponent. In individual combat, approach the enemy until about 50 meters behind him. Carefully take aim and fire. The opponent will fall. One does not need to be an aerobatics artist or a trick shooter, rather one has to have the courage to fly right up to the opponent. If attacked from a single-seater from above, never let up on the throttle, make all turns and dive at full speed. Turn towards the opponent and by pulling up in each turn, try to get above him and never let the enemy get on your back. One can attack a fighter from the front, but this is rare, as the moment for which one is in the right range for combat is only a fraction of a second. When the battle lasts until it is far on the other side and one is alone, one should never obstinately stay with an enemy who through bad shooting or skillful turning one has been unable to shoot down. For a beginner about to face the enemy, the following rules apply. We need no aerial acrobatics, just courageous daredevils. The pilot must master his machine gun by practicing at full speed in high altitude and tight turns. He must know the terrain without a map and the route to and from the front by heart. It is important to know what to do to keep from being shot down. The greatest danger is surprise attack from behind. Most of our pilots, even the best and most experienced, have been surprised and shot down from behind. One without fail must be aware of the airspace behind him. The opponent will look for the most favorable position, diving from out of the sun and shooting one down in a few shots. The correct method if surprised is a sudden and very tight turn and take the offensive as quickly as possible. Richthofen insisted that his pilot should be the best. There was a feeling of strong competition as they all tried to draw level with their leader. However, his feelings about his enemy were mixed. In his autobiography, he wrote, "Everything depends on whether we have for opponents those French tricksters or those daring fellows, the English. I prefer the English. Frequently, the daring of the latter can only be described as stupidity. In their eyes, it may be pluck and bravery. The great thing in air fighting is that the decisive factor does not lay in trick flying, but solely in the personal ability and energy of the aviator. A flying man may be able to loop and do all the tricks imaginable, and yet he may not succeed in shooting down a single enemy. In my opinion, the aggressive spirit is everything, and that spirit is very strong in Germans, hence we shall always retain domination of the air." The French have a different character. They like to set traps and to attack their opponent unawares. That cannot easily be done in the air. Only a beginner can be caught, and one cannot set traps because an aeroplane cannot hide itself. The invisible aeroplane has yet to be discovered. Sometimes, however, the Gaelic blood asserts itself. The Frenchman will attack, but the French attacking spirit is like bottled lemonade that lacks tenacity. In Englishmen, on the other hand, one notices that they are of Germanic blood. Sportsmen take easily to flying, but the Englishmen see flying as nothing but a sport. They take perfect delight in looping the loop, flying on their back and rolling over and indulging in other tricks for the benefit of our soldiers in the trenches. All these tricks may impress someone who attends a sports meeting, but the public at the battlefront is not so appreciative of such things. It demands higher qualifications than trick flying. The rules that applied to confirmed victories for a pilot's score were simple. If the aircraft was shot down on the German side of the lines, the enemy aeroplane, whether intact or wrecked, had to be located at the place the pilot claimed to have shot it down. This had to be verified either by other men in the air or by ground observers. Any that fell on Allied soil were often not confirmed unless somebody else actually saw it crash beyond repair, burn, or it was subsequently shelled by gunfire and seemed to be destroyed. This system did not leave much room for a pilot to try and increase his own score, either by deception or by taking another's claim. Anyone who tried and was caught out soon left the frontline squadron. On the British side of the lines, confirming a victory was more difficult, but as long as the aeroplane attacked was seen to crash, burn, or in some way be destroyed, and was verified by either ground or air observers, it was credited to the victorious pilot. However, with the difficulty of flying in high altitude, perhaps being hotly engaged by enemy aircraft, it wasn't always possible to observe the fate of an aircraft that appeared to be going down for the last time. This gave rise to the claim out of control, or OOC. Pilots, of course, used this spinning down maneuver as a ruse to get out of trouble, and when near the ground would regain proper control and fly off. But provided another pilot confirmed what he also thought was a machine going down out of control and looking certain to crash, this probable victory was confirmed and listed as a victory. It was often claimed by the Allies that Baron von Richthofen didn't play fair in air warfare by surprising his victims from behind and giving them no chance to defend themselves. This was probably true, but that's exactly the job of a fighter pilot, or scout pilot as they were known in World War I, to destroy the maximum enemy forces with the minimum risk to himself and his fellow pilots. By his very trade, he has to gain the advantage of position to strike. Why risk a dogfight when you may come off worse when you can down the opponent without being seen before it's too late? It may not sound chivalrous, but it got the job done, and in von Richthofen's case, done well. One target that von Richthofen never attacked, yet some of the more inexperienced pilots did, were the Allied observation balloons. For he considered these to be a most dangerous target, as they were well protected from the ground crews and by Allied scout patrols. been a quick and easy kill to shoot down one of the balloons in a hail of bullets, leaving the balloonists to parachute to safety and watching the balloons plummet to the ground in a ball of fire, but that swift and seemingly easy kill left the attacker in a vulnerable position that often ended in an equally swift death. Richthofen fought his battles by staying cool, calm and collected, never going for an all or nothing, which is perhaps the main reason why he achieved his final score of 80 aerial victories. Baron von Richthofen kept a trophy room at the family estate in Schweiznitz. This was the room of the great hunter, the walls full of memorabilia and serial numbers on patches of fabric taken from the aircraft that he had downed. This collection seen here was lost after the Second World War when the family fled from the Soviet occupation. It has never been seen since. April 1917 became known as Bloody April to the British, losing 1/3 of their complement of pilots in that month alone. Why was German dominance so strong in the war in the air, and in particular, why was Manfred von Richthofen so successful in shooting down the enemy? Baron von Richthofen scored his 80th victory on the 20th of April 1918 when he shot down a British Sopwith Camel. The next day, on the 21st of April, he was to come up against another Camel, in fact, 7 of them. Richthofen led one flight, whilst Lieutenant Hans Wolff led the second. Lieutenant Wolff, in a letter to Manfred's brother Lothar, wrote, "Scarcely had we arrived at the front in the area around Hamel, when from the side and below us we saw 7 Sopwith Camels. In addition to the 5 of us, Jasta 5 was still in the vicinity, but much further away in the valley of Sailly-le-Sac." Above us were 7 more Sopwith Camels, some of which attacked Jasta 5 whilst the others remained above. 1 or 2 came at us, we began to fight. In the course of the fight I saw that Herr Rittmeister was often near me, but he had not shot anything yet. While Lieutenant Major Karius and I fought against 2 or 3 camels, suddenly I saw the red machine near me as he fired at a camel that first went into a spin and then slipped away in a steep dive to the west. This fight took place on the other side over the heights of Hamlet. We had a rather strong east wind, and Herr Rittmeister hadn't taken that into account. As I now had clear air around me, I got closer to a camel and shot it down. As the camel went down, I looked over at Herr Rittmeister and saw that he was at an extremely low altitude over the Somme, near Corby, and he was right behind an Englishman. I shook my head instinctively and wondered why Herr Rittmeister was following an opponent so far on the other side. While I was looking to see where my opponent had fallen, suddenly I heard a machine gun behind me and saw that I was being attacked by another camel, which had already put 20 holes into my machine. When I luckily got free of that one, I looked around for Herr Rittmeister, but saw no one except Karius, who was close alongside me. Then I became uneasy, as I certainly should have seen Herr Rittmeister. We circled the area for a time and were then again attacked by an Englishman who followed us for about 900 meters over Corby. But of Herr Rittmeister, there was no trace. With a sense of foreboding, I came home. Reports had come in that a red triplane had landed smoothly northwest of Corby. That he was not shot down from behind, I could vouch for. That would have been the most terrible thing for me, as I considered myself to be the personal shield of Herr Rittmeister. Had he succeeded in shooting down the Englishman, then he would have pulled up, but he didn't. He suddenly went into a steep dive and had apparently landed smoothly. Although they had become accustomed to death and destruction, his comrades waited for news. They hoped that their leader would be spared the fate of so many of his victims. The following day they received news confirming that Richthofen's plane had gone down within British lines. By all accounts, Rittmeister Manfred von Richthofen was killed at about 11:45 a.m. German time while hotly pursuing Sopwith F-1 Camel D-3326 of No. 209 Squadron of the British Royal Air Force. While Richthofen chased his intended victim, Second Lieutenant Wilfred May, at even lower altitude along the Somme River Valley, he was himself fired upon by Captain Roy Brown, May's squadron leader. It's also known that Australian gun batteries on the ground opened fire on the red Fokker triplane. At that height, the aircraft would have appeared as blurred images to the troops on the ground, but the gunners knew by now that a khaki image was friendly and a red one was the enemy. Captain Roy Brown claimed the credit for shooting down the Red Baron as he'd become known. So too did the 53rd Australian Field Artillery Battery. Lieutenant Richard Wenzel, another of the Richthofen circus, follows the same view that Richthofen was shot down by ground fire. Over the lines, we attacked 7 Sopwith camels with red noses, the anti-Richthofen people. Due to the strong east wind, we drifted farther and farther over the other side. I saw that one of our machines was in trouble. I thought I recognized it as Richthofen's machine. We broke off combat and went back over the lines. One by one we landed, only Richthofen was missing. Another member of the squadron recalled that another Englishman could have shot him down from behind was out of the question. The possibilities are that the engine quit or that shots fired from the ground hit the aircraft. Second Lieutenant May of the RAF, Richthofen's intended 81st victim, later reported the following. Through lack of experience, I held my guns open too long. One jammed, and then the other, so I spun out of the mess and headed west into the sun for home. The first thing I knew was that I was being fired upon from the rear, and all I could do was to try and dodge my attacker. I noticed that it was a red triplane, but if I'd realized then that it was Richthofen, I'd probably have passed out on the spot. I kept on spinning and dodging for around 12,000 feet until I ran out of sky and had to headshot over the ground. British and German ground troops were firing at us. We passed over the Somme River and started up the valley at a very low altitude. Richthofen was close on my tail. At this point I was a sitting duck, as I was too low down to make a turn away from him. Captain A. Roy Brown completes the report. We went back again and dived down on a pure red triplane which was firing on Lieutenant May. I got in a long burst and the triplane went down vertical and was observed to crash by Lieutenant Mellersh and Lieutenant May. Whether he was shot from an aircraft or from the ground, the fact is that von Richthofen, only 26 years old and a master of aerial combat, had violated a point of his own air combat manual, and in making that one vital error suffered the consequences. One should never obstinately stay with a target which, through bad shooting or skillful turning, he has been unable to shoot down when the battle lasts until it is on the other side and one alone is faced by a greater number of opponents. Richthofen's plane had ploughed into a field. He was dead, a single bullet through the heart. His body was removed from the wreck by Australian ground troops and taken to the Australian Flying Corps base at Poulainville. At 4 p.m. on the 22nd of April, Richthofen's coffin was taken to the cemetery in nearby Bertangle. The funeral attracted many Allied airmen who were paying their last respects to a great pilot and worthy adversary. Baron Manfred von Richthofen was buried with full military honours in a service that was captured on motion picture film. A short while later, a lone British aircraft dropped a wreath and a message containing official confirmation of his death. General von Hoepner sent a note of condolence to Richthofen's men. It read, "Stronger than Richthofen's words were his deeds. It was granted to him to be confirmed and honored to live as a leader and to be cherished as a comrade. We will not direct our gaze on what could have been, rather from what he was. We will derive a living force, a force that stays alert in permanent memorial to his deeds." That memorial is still alive today at Wittmund, as Richthofen's gravestone, saved from the Invalid Cemetery in Berlin, stands between the two gate guards as a proud reminder of the heritage of Jahrgeschwader 71, Richthofen. A memorial to a man that was a born leader who died a national hero, but he wasn't always at ease with such fame and glory. He once wrote, "The battle now taking place on all fronts has become dreadfully serious, for now we must arm ourselves against despair. I imagine now how death would feel breathing down my neck. I'm no longer so insolent in spirit. I've been told by people in high places that I should give up flying, but I'd be miserable with myself if now, burdened with glory and decorations, I were to become a pensioner of my own dignity in order to save my life for the nation whilst every poor fellow in the trenches gives his. I am wretched in spirits after every aerial combat. I go directly to my room. I do not want to see anyone or hear anything. I feel that the war is not as people imagine it, with a roar and a cheer. It is very serious, very grim.